Hi everybody, it's Miss Amy and I'm here to read. What chapter are we on? Chapter 12 of The Indian in the Cupboard by Lynne Reid Banks. So last time we left, Omri had taken Little Bear and Boone to school with him, and it wasn't necessarily going all that great. So they got in trouble and they had to go back into class, and they decided that Little Bear was lonely and they were going to put the two characters together in pockets and trade off. Sammy's got her hair in French braids today and it's just going cuckoo. But anyways, so now we're going to see what happens in chapter 12, which is entitled Trouble with Authority. I wonder who that is going to get in trouble, because it seems to me that Omri and Patrick just got in trouble. So that could be trouble with authority. And then Little Bear is a little bit defiant when it comes to Omri. And Little Bear thinks he's in charge, so he thinks Omri is probably defiant. So let's see what they mean by Trouble with Authority in Chapter 12 of The Indian in the Cupboard by Lynne Reid Banks. Now, boys and girls, remember, I own this book, but I do not own the rights. I'm just sharing it with you. All right. What was left of the morning passed uneventfully. Uneventfully. Miss Amy's all scatterworded. Omri even got a few sums done, but by the time the first whiffs of school lunch were beginning to flood through the classroom, Omri was congratulating himself on a stroke of genius in putting the two little men together. There had not been another peep out of either of them, and when Omri took an opportunity, when the teacher's back was turned, to open his pocket stealthily and peer down into it, he was pleased to see them sitting in the bottom of it, face to face, apparently having a conversation, for they were both gesticulating with their arms. There was too much noise all around for Omri to be able to hear their tiny voices. He had given some thought to the matter of their lunch. He would separate them for that, one into each pocket, and slip some dry bits of food down to them. Omri left himself play with the wonderful fantasy of what the other kids' reaction would be if he casually brought them out and sat them on the edge of his plate. Funny to think that he would certainly have done it only a week ago without thinking about the dangers. The bell rang at last. There was the usual stampede, and Omri found himself in the line next to Patrick. "Come on, then, hand him over," Patrick whispered. I'm sorry, I should have said it as a whisper. "Come on, then, hand him over," whispered Patrick over his tray as they shuffled forward toward the fragrant food slots. "Not now, everyone would see. You said at lunchtime." "After lunch." "Now, I want to feed them." "Well, you can have Boone, but I want to feed Little Bear. They're treating these little guys like they're animals or pets." "Well, I already read that. Okay. You said I could have them both," said Patrick, no longer in a whisper. Others in line began to turn their heads. "Will you shut up?" hissed Omri. "No," said Patrick in a loud, clear voice. He held out his hand. Omri felt trapped and furious. He looked into Patrick's eyes and saw what happens even to the nicest people when they want something badly and are determined to get it, come what may. Omri slammed his empty tray down on the floor and, taking Patrick by the wrist, pulled him out of the line and into a quiet corner in the hall. "Listen to me," Omri grated out between his teeth, clenched in anger. "If you let anything happen to Little Bear, I will bash you so hard your teeth will fall out." This, of course, is what happens even to the nicest people when they are in a trap. With that, He groped in his pocket and brought the two little men out. He didn't look at them or say goodbye to them. He just put them carefully into Patrick's hand and walked away. Omri had lost his appetite, so he didn't get back in the line, but Patrick did. He even pushed a bit. He was so eager to get some food to give to the cowboy and the Indian. Omri watched from a distance. He wished now he hadn't been too angry to give Patrick some pretty clear instructions, like telling him to separate them. Now that he thought about it, perhaps it wasn't a good idea to feed them in a pocket. Who wants to eat something that's descended between two layers of cloth and collected bits of dust and fluff? If he'd still had them, he would have taken them to some private place and taken them out to eat properly. Why had he ever brought them to school at all? The dangers here were too awful. Watching, he suddenly stiffened. Patrick had reached the food slot now and received his dinner. He almost ran with it to the table. He did try to go to one in the outside row near the windows, but a lunch lady stopped him and made him sit in the middle of the hall. There were children all around him and on either side. Surely, thought Omri, surely he wasn't going to try to feed them there. He saw Patrick take a pinch of his bread and slip it into his pocket. He wasn't wearing a jacket. The men were in his jeans pocket. Fortunately, the jeans were new and loose, but still he had to half stand up to get the bit of bread in. When he was sitting down, the people in his pocket must be pretty well squished against his leg. Omri imagined them trying to eat, held down flat by the two thick layers of cloth. He could almost see Patrick imagining it too. He was frowning uneasily and shifting around in his chair. The girl next to him spoke to him. She was probably telling him not to wriggle. Patrick said something sharply in reply. Omri sucked in his breath. If only Patrick wouldn't draw attention to himself. Suddenly he gasped. The girl had given Patrick a hard push. He pushed her back. She nearly went off the chair. She stood up and pushed him with all her might, using both hands. He went flying over backward, half onto the boy on the other side of him, who jumped from his place, spilling part of his dinner. Patrick landed on the floor. Sounds like a big old mess to me. Omri didn't stop to think. He raced toward him across the hall, dodging in and out of the tables. His heart was hammering with terror. If Patrick had fallen on them, Omri had a terrible fleeting vision of the pocket of Patrick's jeans with blood stains spreading. He clamped down on his imagination. By the time he got there, Patrick was back on his feet. But now the other boy was angry and clearly looking for a fight. The girl on the other side looked ready to clobber him too. Omri pushed between them, but a stout lunch lady was ahead of him. Here, what's going on? She asked, barging in with her big stomach and sturdy arms. She grabbed Patrick with one hand and the other boy with the other, and kind of dangled them by their arms like a pair of cats. No fighting in here! Thank you very much, or it'll be off to the headmaster's office before you can say knife. The old boomin' pack of you. Oh, goodness, Miss Amy's getting tongue-tied. She dumped them down in their separate chairs as if they'd been bags of shopping. They were both thoroughly tousled and red-faced. Omri's eyes shot down at Patrick's thigh. No blood. No movement either, but at least no blood. Everyone began to eat again as the stout lunch lady stamped away, tut-tutting as she went. Omri leaned over the back of Patrick's chair and whispered out of a dry mouth, "Are they all right?" What do you think? You think they're all right? Sounds a little dangerous. Guess we'll have to keep on reading to figure it out. How do I know? Said Patrick sulkily, but his hand crept down and delicately explored the slight bump on the top of his leg where his pocket was. Omri held his breath. Yeah, they're okay. They're moving, Patrick muttered. Omri went out into the playground. He felt too jumpy to stay indoors or eat anything. How would he get them back from Patrick, who quite obviously was not a fit person to have charge of them? Nice as he was as a friend, he just wasn't fit. It must be because he didn't take them seriously yet. He simply didn't seem to realize that they were people. Boys and girls, would you like to be hanging out in someone's pocket all day? I know I wouldn't. I'm not a big fan of Patrick right now. I sure hope he gets a little bit better than how he's been behaving. Because quite honestly, I don't like him. When the bell rang, Omri still hadn't come to any decision. He hurried back into school. Patrick was nowhere to be seen. Omri looked around for him frantically. Maybe he'd gone into the toilet to be private and give the men something to eat. Ooh, that's just nasty. Let's take this here little Indian and this cowboy into the toilet to eat. It smells great in here. You think that would be a good place to take an Indian and a cowboy to eat? I don't think that's a good place to take anybody to eat, if you ask my opinion. But you didn't. Omri went in there and called him softly, but there was no answer. He returned to his place in the classroom. There was no sign of Patrick, and there continued to be no sign of him till about halfway through the lesson. Not one word of which Omri took in. He was so worried. At last, when the teacher turned her back to write on the board, Patrick slipped around the partition, rushed across the room silently, and dropped into his chair. Where have you been? Asked Omri under his breath. In the music room, said Patrick smugly. The music room was not a room at all, but a little alcove off the gym in which the musical instruments were stored together with some of the bulkier apparatus like the long horse. I sat under the horse and fed them, he muttered out of the side of his mouth. Only they weren't hungry. I bet they weren't, said Omri, after all they've been through. Cowboys and Indians are used to rough treatment, Patrick retorted. Anyway, I left some food in my pocket for later if they wanted it. It'll get all squishy. Oh, so what? Don't fuss so much. They don't mind. Do you think Patrick really knows Boone and Little Bear well enough to know that they wouldn't mind some squish-squashed, lint-covered food? He's such a big mouth. There goes Miss Amy again talking about Patrick. I'm sorry. I'm just not happy with him right now. How do you know what they mind? Said Omri hotly, forgetting to whisper. The teacher turned around. Oh, so there you are, Patrick. And where have you been, may I inquire? Sorry, Miss Hilton. I didn't ask if you were sorry. I asked where you have been. Patrick coughed and lowered his head. In the toilet, he mumbled. For nearly 20 minutes? I don't believe you. Are you telling me the truth? Patrick mumbled something. Patrick, answer me, or I'll send you to the headmaster. This was the ultimate threat. The headmaster was very fierce and could make you feel about 2 inches high. So, Patrick says, I was in the music room, and that's true, and I forgot the time. And that's not true, added Omri silently. And Miss Hilton was nobody's fool. She knew it too. You'd better go see Mr. Johnson, she said. Omri, you go too. Chattering away there as usual. Tell him I said you were both disturbing the class and that I'm extremely tired of it. Uh-oh, the boys have gotten in trouble again. Boys and girls, if you ever have a little cowboy or Indian, let me just tell you, don't take them to school, especially if they're alive. If you already are a chatterbox, they sure ain't going to help you. But anyways, back to the story. They got up silently and walked through the tables while the girls giggled, ha 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 ha, and the boys smirked and looked sorry for them. According to whether they liked them or not, Omri glanced at Patrick under his eyebrows. They were in for it now. Outside the headmaster's office, they stopped. You knock, whispered Omri. No, you, retorted Patrick. They dithithered. Dithithered? That's a new word for me. For a few minutes. I guess dithithered might mean disgusted, argued about it. I don't know. You might have to Google it. I might have to Google it later. Maybe I can tell you in chapter 13 what it means. They dithithered for a few minutes, but it was useless to put it off. So in the end, they both knocked together. Yes, came a rather irritable voice from inside. They edged around the door. Mr. Johnson was seated at his large desk, working on some papers. He looked up at once. Ooh, it's so different now. Back in this time, they had to walk down there themselves and be pretty brave. That's kind of scary. In my day, I know they had phones and intercoms, but not like they do now. You just push a little button on the wall and call down to the principal's office. But these boys had to take themselves down there and tell the principal what they did. Or excuse me, in this case, it's the headmaster. Well, you two, what is it this time? Fighting in the playground or talking in class? Talking, they said. And Patrick added, and I was late. Why? I just was. Oh, don't you waste my time, snapped Mr. Johnson. There must have been a reason. I was in the music room and I forgot the time, Patrick repeated. I don't remember you being especially musical. What were you doing in the music room? Playing? Which instrument? Asked Mr. Johnson with a touch of sarcasm. Just playing. With what? He asked, raising his voice. With, he glanced at Omri, threw him a warning grimace. What are you pulling faces about, Omri? You look as if someone's just stuck a knife into you. Omri started to giggle, and that set Patrick off. Somebody just did, spluttered Patrick. Mr. Johnson was in no such jolly mood. However, he was scowling horribly. What are you talking about, you silly boy? Stop that idiotic noise. Patrick's giggles were getting worse. If they hadn't been where they were, Omri thought Patrick would have folded up completely. Someone did stick a knife into him, hiccuped Patrick and added, a very small one. His voice went off into a sort of whining. Omri had stopped giggling and was staring in awful anticipation at Patrick. When Patrick got into this state, he was apt to do and say anything, like someone who's drunk. Omri took hold of his arm and gave it a sharp shake. Shut up, he hissed. Mr. Johnson got up slowly and came around his desk. Both boys fell back a step. But Patrick didn't stop giggling. On the contrary, it got worse. He seemed to be getting completely helpless. Mr. Johnson loomed over him and took him by his shoulder. Listen here, my lad, he said in a fearsome tone. I want you to pull yourself together this moment and tell me what you meant. If there is any child in this school who so far forgets himself as to stick knives into people or even pretend to, I want to know about it. Now, who was it? Little Bear, Patrick squeaked out. Tears were running down his cheeks. Omri gasped. Don't! Who? Asked Mr. Johnson, puzzled. Patrick didn't answer. He couldn't. He was now speechless with nervous, almost hysterical laughter. Mr. Johnson gave him a shake of his own that rocked him back and forth on his feet like one of those weighted dolls that won't fall down. Then abruptly, he let him go and strode back to his desk. You seem to be quite beyond yourself, he said sharply. I think the only thing I can do is telephone your father. Patrick stopped laughing instantly. Ah, that's better, said Mr. Johnson. Now, who did you say stabbed Omri? Patrick stood rigidly with a soldier at attention. He didn't look at Omri. He just stared straight at Mr. Johnson. I want the truth, Patrick, and I want it now. Little Bear, said Patrick very clearly and much louder than necessary. Little who? Bear. Mr. Johnson looked blank as well he might. Is that somebody's nickname, or is this your idea of a joke? Patrick gave his head one stiff shake. Omri was staring at him as if paralyzed. Was he going to tell? He knew Patrick was afraid of his father. Patrick, I shall ask you once more, who is this little bear? Patrick opened his mouth. Omri clenched his teeth. Oh! He was helpless. Patrick said, he's an Indian. Oh, what? Said Mr. Johnson. His voice was very quiet now. He didn't sound annoyed anymore. An Indian! Mr. Johnson looked at him steadily for more seconds, his chins resting on his hands. You are too old to tell those sort of lies, he said quietly. It's not a lie, Patrick shouted, suddenly making both Omri and Mr. Johnson jump. It's not a lie. He's a real live American Indian. To Omri's utter horror, he saw that Patrick was beginning to cry. Mr. Johnson saw it too. He was not an unkind man. No headmaster's much good if he can't scare the wits out of children when necessary. But Mr. Johnson didn't enjoy making them cry. Now then, Patrick, none of that, he said gruffly. But Patrick misunderstood. He thought he was still saying he didn't believe him. He now said the words Omri had been dreading most. It's true, and I can prove it. And his hand went to his pocket. Omri did the only thing possible. He jumped at him and knocked him over. He sat on his chest and pinned his hands down on the ground. You dare! You dare! You dare! He ground out between clenched teeth before Mr. Johnson managed to drag him off. Get out of the room, he roared. Here we have a picture of the headmaster, Mr. Johnson, about getting up at his table as Omri reaches for Patrick. Hoo-wee, they're getting themselves in some kind of mess now, aren't they? I won't, Omri choked out. He'd been crying himself in a minute. He felt so desperate. Out! Omri felt his collar seized. He was almost hiked off his feet. The next thing he knew, he was outside the door and hearing the key turning. Without stopping to think, Omri hurled himself against the door, kicking and banging his fists. Don't show him, Patrick! Don't show him, Patrick! Don't! I'll kill you if you show him, he screamed at the top of his lungs. Footsteps came running. Through his tears and a sort of red haze, Omri saw Mrs. Hunt, the headmaster's elderly secretary, bearing down on him. He got in a couple more good kicks and shouts, Don't! Before she got a hold of him and with both arms around his waist, carried him shrieking and both arms around his waist. carried him shrieking and struggling boldly into her own little office. One minute she put him down. He tried to bolt, but she hung on. Omri! Omri! Stop it! Calm down! Whatever's come over you, you naughty boy! Please don't let him! Go in and stop him, Omri cried. Who? What? Before Omri could explain, he heard the sudden of footsteps from the next room. Suddenly, Mr. Johnson appeared holding Patrick by the elbow. The headmaster's face was dead white and his mouth was partly open. Patrick's head was hung down and his shoulders were heaving with sobs. One look at them told Omri the worst. Patrick had shown him. And that, boys and girls, is the end of chapter 12. And you'll just have to come back and find out what happens in chapter 13. In the Indian and the Cupboard by Lynne Reid Banks. Hope you enjoyed today's story, and I'm glad I left you on a cliffhanger. We'll have to see what happens tomorrow. And if you read this or listen to this before bed, good night and sleep tight.